Hi everyone, this is Cyber Protection Magazine with Patrick Boch today, and with me I have Mike Schuricht from Bitglass, and they have created a very interesting report about data on the dark web, a report which they have done previously in 2015, and they sort of rerun the experiment this year. Yeah, Mike, can you give us a summary of what happened in the report and also maybe compare that to what you found out in 2015?
Sure, no problem. What we had done in 2015 was actually quite interesting, and we didn't quite know what was going to happen when we tried it out. And so what we did is we have this technology called a watermarking technology, where we take a file and we're able to track that file. We can track places like the places it was opened from if you do something like a reverse IP lookup, and we're able to identify that that comes from, Germany versus the UK versus the US versus an anonymous proxy or something like that, right? So what we did is we created basically a honeypot where we created a number of different types of files, things that were interesting at the time. In that particular case, back in 2015, it was things like the Anthem breach and stuff like that, as well as credit card numbers and whatnot. And so what we did is we took those files that we created as these honeypots and put them links to them at various places on the dark web. And then we tracked both the views of the places where they were posted, the clicks on the links that were provided, as well as the openings of those files and the places that they originated from. So that was what we did again this last year, a couple months ago, actually. Same kind of thing, except we added a couple variants. So we did the same type of view tracking and click tracking and whatnot, but this time we added some things that were associated with things like government Twitter accounts, things like different types of retail accounts, things like cryptocurrency type accounts, which are obviously hot from a hacking perspective these days, and posted on different types of paste bin type replicas in the dark bin, same dark web, same kind of thing in the past, and we observed the results basically this year again.
Okay, and so what, from your perspective, what were the most interesting findings from maybe both 2015, but also 2021, and then the comparison in between?
So we wanted to make sure that things were similar, right? So what we did is we did a 15-day study where we did this for about 2 weeks of a time duration on both the 2015 and the 2021 analysis. And what we found was that actually it was 11 times larger in 2021. So over that 2-week period, we saw something like 1,100 clicks back in 2015 and views basically of this data. Here we saw that within less than 24 hours. So 11,000% larger amount of views this year. And that was obviously very significant. The other thing that changed too between the prior tracking that we had done is the origination of those views and those opens and those clicks and whatnot. And so in the past, it was 67% of those were coming from things like anonymous proxies. So things like Tor, things like just anonymous proxies on the web trying to obscure the location of the actual person doing the viewing. And this year it was 93%. So significantly higher of this use of the anonymous proxies. And you see a lot of that just growth over the last 6 years of people trying to avoid some of this tracking that's going on from various different types of government agencies, ad agencies, and things like that. So that's definitely something that changed, as well as the file opens. So we did see that there was a lot of focus mainly on people opening the files that were associated with some of these interesting type scenarios, more for hacktivism, things like the government type Twitter accounts where someone wants to get access to that, so they might be able to do some posts themselves, as well as things like drop shipping type attacks for retail. So from a retail perspective, Amazon accounts and Walmart accounts and things like that, where someone can get something shipped to them and then they take it to this drop location and take whatever that package is from a stealing perspective. Whereas some of the other stuff associated with the crypto accounts and some of the other stuff was less plentiful from a click perspective. So those were some of the high level observations, at least, Patrick.
Okay, maybe on one of these observations on the retailing, I mean, it absolutely makes sense that hackers would go after sort of the big fish, Amazon, Walmart, and
Yeah.
all these kind of stuff. But what about the smaller retailers? Should they worry that their data is exposed on the dark web and that hackers can get access to sort of their platforms?
So what we basically had done so in the past, remember back in the 2015 timeframe, what I was talking about was things like the Anthem breach and whatnot, and a lot of credentials and information, PII, basically about healthcare type situations, as well as credit card numbers, were what we had leaked in the past. This time, the storyline was more about something that we saw, which was the LinkedIn crawling that occurred more in June, correlated to the RockU 2021 type attack. So what that was one of the largest dumps of usernames and passwords, right? And so what we purported here from a kind of a file name and perspective for these honeypots basically was that someone took the username and passwords from this large dump, correlated it with things like LinkedIn, and now putting those things together, because people reuse their passwords, you'll get a login to the government Twitter account. You get a login to Amazon, and you can drop ship things. So we didn't actually do that type of smaller retail type study, but the risk is still there regardless. I mean, you see this password reuse all over the place, and what ends up happening is that if people do correlate those two things together and they find out that you're using this password, they find out that you are Patrick and you're associated with this identity, now they get to log into your corporate account. And so there's a risk there, and I don't think it's just for the large retailers.
Yeah, it's something that we've been saying all along. I mean, you have to have a good password hygiene in order to avoid these types of scenarios. Now, maybe let's go a little bit away from the sort of the platforms which are attacked, but sort of from the cyber criminals who are doing it.
Right.
You mentioned that VPN usage or anonymous proxy usage has been risen as compared to 2015.
Yes.
I don't know if you can, from based on that report, whether you can estimate how many, if I be a criminal, how many choices of using a VPN do I have? Can I use just anyone, or would some of the sort of more serious ones would prevent these types of accesses to dark web or something like that?
So there's actually hundreds of them, if not thousands, that are in use today. One of the things that we did see was a bit of a shift from things necessarily coming directly from Tor. Tor was one of the most, the onion router, right, was one of the most prolific on anonymous proxies, basically, to get your anonymity, so that, when you go in, and even for legitimate uses, for things like whistleblowers and whatnot, that log into Wall Street Journal or whatever it is, and they Washington Post and post something that obscures where they posted it from, that use has kind of spread across the board. And so there are, I guess it's primarily Linux platforms, but there are operating systems that operate like this now today, that ship traffic through anonymous proxies to avoid some of this tracking. And what I do think, actually, it's not necessarily in the report, but what I do think is that that's become even more important with COVID and the pandemic and whatnot, with people working from home, right? Because all of your traffic now is originating from an IP address, which tends to remain static. I know they use, from a service provider perspective, dynamic DNS and assign you different IP addresses. But a lot of times, law-wise, that actually is set consistently for tracking purposes, at least here in the US. And I'm pretty sure that's true in Germany and other places in Europe too, where they don't like, they being the government, don't like that the ISPs will switch your IP address because they want to have some sort of tracking there. So what I would say is that there's even more usage of these anonymous proxies by individuals that are more aware, regardless if it's hacking related or not, that there's tracking going on the internet, right? So because of that, I think there's been growth, and because of that, in general, people that are accessing the dark web are using these anonymous proxies. I mean, the only way to get to the places that we posted it, which was on Tor, on onion addresses, is by using an anonymous proxy, right? It's not available on the general internet. So that being a requirement to get access to the content is something that may have driven the traffic that way, but everyone that is doing this viewing and this monitoring and this looking at things on the dark web is already using one of those proxies. So it's become more prolific, I would say, over the year. As I said, 67% versus the 93 we saw in 2021.
Another thing I noted in the report is that the criminals are using or increasingly using virtual machines to sort of drive the attack rather than probably their own laptop. And isn't that something because most of these virtual machines are located in from some kind of sort of cloud provider? Isn't that something that sort of Amazon, Azure, and Google, being the three main hyperscalers here, isn't that something they should and could prevent?
Well, they do try to prevent that. They do monitor what's going on inside of their virtual infrastructures, and when someone does spin up a machine or a job or a service or a serverless function or something like that, they're looking at what it's doing, and if there is an association with things like hacking, right? Things like nefarious activity that can be associated with maliciousness and hacking and stuff like that, then yeah, they will spin down those machines and take them back. One of the things we did see was that one of these anonymous proxy services did allow an anonymous hosting capability too. There are these new places that aren't necessarily the hyperscalers, but allow you to resolve addresses and sites and DNS to places where people can post stuff from just an advocacy perspective of sharing in general of content, not necessarily associated with hacking per se, but the fact that these things are happening in co-location facilities and hosting providers as well, beyond just GCP and in AWS and Azure, is interesting too. I would say that one of the things we did see also was that there were two actual cybersecurity vendors that also appeared to have found the files and actually opened them, that appeared to be related to dark web crawling. So that was kind of interesting as well. And those two callbacks did come from, I think it was GCP specifically. One of them was a Google service, for example.
Okay, that's interesting. So apparently you're not the only ones doing those types of research.
Well, there are companies that are dedicated directly to crawling the dark web for a number of different reasons. One of them is to tell you that exactly what we were illustrating here, that your users' credentials have been compromised and there may be a risk to your business. So there are enterprise companies that will sell you a service that does this, and then there are others that will help you mine the dark web for intent and sentiment and things like that, kind of like people do with Twitter and LinkedIn and stuff like that for other purposes on the normal way.
Okay, and then maybe let's talk a little bit about where the attacks come from. And in your report, it said that a lot of them are coming from the US. What was sort of surprising me is that in the report you actually said that it's surprisingly coming from the US states. But why did that surprise you?
Well, I think some of the first things that we had seen back in 2015, for example, were some of the file opens and some of these view events that occurred when someone found the thing on the dark web, clicked the link, and then downloaded the file and actually opened it. Came from places like people that were younger, kind of experimenting and whatnot. So universities, for example. Now, it's not to necessarily say, to answer your question more specifically, that it was a quote unquote script kiddies. So someone younger that found something that opened the file and whatnot, and weren't as aware of the fact that they could be tracked and things like that. It could also be that those machines that the origination of the IP came from had been hacked, right? But maybe they weren't as secure. So one of the things to point out, I guess, here to answer your question, is that while it is surprising to see attacks from the US against US based things that are homed in, Amazon's a global company, but homed in the US from a location perspective for the headquarters, is more that it's less obvious when someone is doing a hacking, like a brute force attack or trying to compromise a credential, when it comes from a place that you trust, right? So if your organization is based in the US and hackers know that, they'll likely attack you from the US so that it doesn't just throw up a red flag, seeing something come from North Korea or from some other place where you don't do business, Russia, things like that. And so that's definitely an obvious thing. But these days, for all these large organizations, they're global companies and global organizations anyways, so they have traffic and users all over the world. So while the US was something that we didn't necessarily expect to be so prevalent, it is just the reality these days. So I wouldn't glean too much from that per se, but it was a little bit different than what we saw in 2015, which was more the universities as opposed to some ISPs.
So maybe, it might not be one of the largest findings, but then again, it sort of adds up. If I would draw a conclusion here, that means that basically the report shows that compared to 2015, there was more activity, it was faster, and it was more sophisticated. Would that be a good summary of the report?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. It was all those things. I would agree.
And then now, of course, the big questions: what can companies or we as individuals do in order to prevent these types of things to happening to us? Is there anything besides a good password hygiene, obviously?
Yeah, I mean, that might be one of the most important takeaways of this whole thing, right? I mean, while it's interesting to look at the data, and that's one of the reasons we did the research. The other thing that you want to do is typical type stuff. So obviously, password hygiene is important. Although requiring a user to change their password actually sometimes leads to people taking Post-it notes and writing them down and sticking on places, which is also what you don't want. And it's hard to correlate the fact that someone is using a different password on a personal service versus their corporate as well. So that's something you need to train your users not to do, and to use unique passwords and whatnot. But the things that you want to be doing are things that Bitglass and whatnot provides from a security service edge perspective. And so blocking or definitely monitoring the logins that are coming from these anonymous proxies are critical, right? And so while that might be a legitimate use case for hiding your identity and whatnot, you don't really want people to be doing that kind of thing and using these anonymous proxies to access corporate services, right? When I'm logging into Zoom and I'm logging into Office 365 and Box and all my Salesforce and all my normal top 20 SaaS apps that are being used at the organization, that should really not be through an anonymous proxy. So that's kind of a red flag there immediately. And so identifying and controlling those and sometimes blocking those is critical. Looking for suspicious location type detection is also critical. So when someone logs in normally from Germany and all of a sudden we see them log in from Japan in a short period of time, you don't necessarily want to block that. Or detecting that the device is brand new that you've never seen before. You don't necessarily want to block that, but what you do want to do is do step-up multi-factor authentication, right? Make sure that person is the person you think they are. So what's going on here is a bit of identification of anomalous type activities, this user and entity behavioral analytics component to these platforms, right? That can identify the suspiciousness of the activity that's going on. So maybe you did get the multi-factor challenge right, and you got the password right, and you logged in, but there could also be then some sort of malicious activity that's associated with an insider threat too. So if normally, Patrick is going in and looking at Salesforce content and whatnot, and accessing Office 365, and then all of a sudden over the weekend in the middle of the night, he logs in, he passes those 2 tests, but he starts downloading atypical amounts of content or visiting all the opportunities that exist in a region and downloading reports like that from Salesforce. That's atypical behavior, right? So what you would want to do there at minimum is monitor that, typically put someone in a monitored group where they're at this escalated alerting and logging at minimum, but sometimes cutting off the account is critical too, and saying, hey, if you want to regain access here, we saw this activity over the weekend, just contact IT and we'll unlock your account. So there's this not just at login time monitoring and controls to reduce attack surface to start, and then looking at what the person's doing over time to make sure you don't detect one of these breaches that might be occurring within your organization that you don't know about. And so I think one of the key things here is that when adding a a protection mechanism. There are some of these vendors, obviously they're large companies like Microsoft and whatnot with M365 that have capabilities inside of the platforms. But what you don't have really, if you use one of those service specific or account specific security precautions, is really a holistic view of, is my attack surface the same across my 100 different types of applications that are in use from a business day perspective. And that's where when a third party comes in, like Bitglass, do that monitoring and kind of giving you the single pane of glass and control. So making sure you take a step back and are controlling all these things and monitoring all these things is really critical, so that you can avoid things like a breach or malicious insiders stealing all your Salesforce opportunities and whatnot and leaving and going to a competitor.
All right, thanks. That was, yeah, I agree with the holistic view, and then also sort of a multi-layered strategy in your cybersecurity approach, starting with things like security awareness amongst your users, but then ending up with more complex solutions like logging, monitoring, user behavior analytics, and stuff like that. So yeah, thanks, Mike. That was very interesting report. We're looking forward to maybe seeing another one of these in another 6 years and see what's changed then.
No problem. Great to talk to you and meet you. Thank you.